Hello, this is Angelia, and you're listening to or watching the podcast, Why You Do What You Do. The podcast that talks about human development and psychology to maybe help you figure out a little bit more about why you do what you do. And we've been talking about some abnormal behaviors and things, and we're going to pick back up on that. The theory regarding accidental or deliberate teaching has support too, because children learn what they live. You can accidentally teach them some bad stuff, and you can also deliberately teach them some bad stuff by doing it yourself. Fagin, the rascally leader of the troupe of pickpockets in Oliver Twist, if you haven't seen that, it's worth seeing, I guess, teaches immoral and illegal behaviors to sustain his lifestyle. He teaches the children to steal for him and then bring the stuff back. However, most teaching of deviant behavior is not intentional. Usually it occurs because the parent of a child are themselves troubled, and they unwittingly socialize their children into similar behavior. So you got all these people out there who are doing bad things, modeling bad things for the children because children are watching, and then they wonder why their children grow up to be so messed up. And it's like, I'm watching you for 5 minutes. You're talking about doing drugs and everything, and drinking and talking trash and stuff. You wonder why your kids are messed up. I don't know. Clearly, this approach is quite the opposite of the disease model. Because, the disease model, if you remember, said it's an organic thing, it's a problem. But again, if you were a trashy person, if you're watching, sorry Jerry, but Jerry Springer in the middle of the day, and let your kids watch this stuff, they're going to model this stuff. That's a shame. Put on Mr. Rogers for them, let them watch something good. I don't think he's even in syndication anymore, but Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood is. But anyway, that's just my opinion. If you have to watch Jerry Springer, do it at night, when the kids are in bed, and keep the volume low. That's just the way you should be dealing with that, in my opinion. Modern behaviorists, such as Ullman and Krasner, insist that it is ridiculous to search for the bug that causes abnormal behavior as it is to search for the bug that causes problems with learning a foreign language, because there's not one, right? You can either get it or you can't. It's just the way you are. And again, there's the nature-nurture thing. There is some nature involved, but there's also nurture involved in psychological problems. So sometimes it's not a this or that. It's a cumulative effect that causes problems. Bandura and social learning. Although respondent and operant conditioning are two important methods of learning, remember we looked at that. Try not to sneeze here. There is a third way in which we learn behavior, a method demonstrated by Albert Bandura. Essentially, he feels that people learn by imitation, and we know that's all true. My little kids must be out there working, and they get their little toy hammer, or a stick or something, and they be working too. I've got some sculptures in my living room that they made me in the garage while they were working with their dad. Now I'll keep those things forever. So a process he called modeling. In modeling, children in particular observe the actions of adults who are supposed to be role models. In case you didn't know that, sorry if I'm the first one to tell you that, adults. And then imitate their behavior, because like I say, children learn what they live. They're going to imitate your behavior. So if you don't want your kid cussing, don't cuss around them. If you don't want your kid doing bad things, don't do bad things. Bandura does not deny the importance of reinforcement in his social learning theory, because there are rewards and punishments in life. And like in your household, there should be rewards and punishments. Indeed, his own research proves again how strong the concept of reward is. Because anything you get rewarded for, you're likely to keep doing. In one experiment, he asked 3 groups of children to watch different films showing aggressive behavior. And I can tell you that happened in my own home. I didn't let my children watch violent shows. But a friend of mine and her stepchildren watched violent shows. So we were watching, they come over one day and we were watching the, KET, nice kid shows. And they said, oh no, it's time for this show. We want to watch this show. And I told my friend, I said, we don't watch that here. She said, okay, one day, well, I'll let them do it. Okay, so I'll let them watch it. My kids loved it. But of course it was a violent show. There was fighting and everything. Well, then they started wanting to watch it. So I would sometimes let them watch something. But I noticed the fighting started almost immediately after they watched this show. The bad things that were done on the show were done in my living room. So, children learn what they see. So I'm just say, I don't care what everyone else's kids are watching. If your kids are watching the good stuff, let them watch the good stuff. Don't let them watch that trash, because it's going to affect them and they're going to act it out. The groups that saw aggression being rewarded or saw it elicited no consequences were much more apt to respond with aggressive behavior than the group that saw it being punished. And their proponents, that's why they argue for the death penalty. I don't believe in that. But, if you're rewarded, if you don't get caught, then you're much more likely to do it again and again because you feel like it was worth it to you. A contribution of modeling is that it demonstrates how complex behavior or skills, such as playing tennis, cooking, driving a car, can be learned. Because, like I said, children learn where they live. They're watching. All the little eyes are watching. According to this view, not every behavior must be reinforced before it can be learned. Because sometimes they just take an interest in it and they think, hey, I can do this. I want to do this. And so they will learn it. Furthermore, we can observe a model today and still be able to engage in the particular behavior days, weeks, or even years later. And sometimes that's a problem. That's why I talk about, relationships and being in healthy relationships. Because if your sons see dad treating mom a certain way, they're more likely to do it themselves. If daughters see mom doing a certain thing a certain way, they might be more likely to do it themselves. So that's a example of, modeling behavior that might not happen that day or week or month, but years later it might show up. Social behavior learning also suggests that there are some internal processes at work. That is, there is more in learning than simply responding to external stimuli. Because like I said, they're going to have to be taking an interest in it. Because you don't learn anything you're not really interested in. We all know that from school. If there's a class we didn't care about or whatever, we didn't learn it. We might have learned it for the test or whatever, but if you think back now, you can't remember it. So, in his latest writings, Bandura devotes a good deal of attention to possible cognitive processes involving learning. Nevertheless, he continues to focus on the external factors that determine behavior, which places him within the behavioral school of thought. The sociogenic view, social forces. A number of psychologists see abnormal behavior as a problem caused by broad and widespread social forces. Individuals caught up in these forces are like the powerless pawns on a chessboard, meaning, people are basically leading you to make decisions. Behind them, moving them around, are strong cultural currents, especially poverty and social disorder. Now, I feel like I was a victim of some social currents that went on here a few years ago. I was in the leader of a nonprofit, and we were doing well, and we had good connections in the community, in the poorer side of town. But then suddenly there became a rift in the community. And suddenly I was on the wrong side of that just because of the way I look. So there were some destructive behaviors from these people that caused me to decide I couldn't keep the thing open because I couldn't find qualified people to take over for me. So I ended up closing up the charity because I was the incorporator, and said, well, we're just going to have to not do this anymore because I can't do it justice, and I can't find anyone who's willing, to take over or who is qualified to take over, and that had a lot to do with the cultural current in our city at that point in time. There have been poverty studies done that show, that also will affect people's behavior, and social unrest, social disorder. There were people acting out, in the community and running people off the road and, yelling at them and stuff. And, these were innocent people who did nothing. So, that can be a problem in society. People who live in abject poverty and in chaotic social conditions are reminded daily how the other half lives. And you've, I'm sure, heard that saying, go down here and let's see how the other half lives. That's bitterness, clearly. That life is glorified on billboards and in almost every TV show and movie. Because, if you think about that, everybody's glamorized, and that's not real life. If you watched, my mother used to watch Dallas and things back in the day, and, all those people were rich and had money, and, I'll look at the shows, a lot of these people rich, have money, they get the latest clothes, jewelry, etc. And that's not real life. So if you're trying to keep up with those folks, you're going to make yourself poor. The poor encounter well-dressed people on city streets, at least in the better sections, and must then face their own world. Poor food, inadequate clothing and shelter, filthy living conditions, street crime, and a don't trust anybody attitude that leaves them virtually isolated. And I know in my own neighborhood, it used to be, when we moved in here, it was a nice neighborhood. It was mostly older folks. Everybody took care of their place. They had trees, flowering trees, bushes, flowers everywhere. And everybody had gardens. And then as the older folks passed, and their family inherited it, they either sold it to someone or, was renting it out. And the neighborhood changed. And now most people out here have a security system. We do. Because people will break into your windows and break into your stuff. And, you kind of have to have that now. And that's a shame because it used to be, you could probably walk off and left your door unlocked there for a while. We had a great neighbor across the street. My kids kind of considered him like a grandpa almost. He saw everything. And he saw anything out of place, he'd come over and tell you, I saw this, saw that, looking at this. That's how it used to be. But it's not like that anymore. And, there's very few people in this neighborhood. There's like one people that we would still probably go talk to. Because, like I said, there's a lot of thieves, and I don't know why there is that, they say honor among thieves, but that's not true because they're stealing from each other out here. And it's like, what's wrong with you people? You're stealing from poor people stealing from poor people. If you want to steal something good, go out in the rich neighborhoods and find you some stuff. But, I don't condone that, so I'm just saying it doesn't make sense. There is no way to brighten this picture and no way out. And that's how a lot of people feel. When I was going out there in the poor end of town and teaching and preaching and, holding workshops and things like that, a lot of people felt that way. Like, oh, well, we can't do what you can do. And it's like, that's not true. Other people have done it too. This is what you've been conditioned to believe. Angry, confused, depressed, they eventually give way to despair. And we know from, the Great Depression that's kind of how people went back in the day. Support for this idea was provided by the research findings of a study conducted by Ferris and Dunham. They reported that in the Chicago areas, the highest admission rates for schizophrenia came from the central city, which, that even without that study, could just be the fact that you have a higher concentration of population. A lot of these studies, looked at things like that and said, oh, the city. But you go into a city, you have 200,000 people, and you go into the suburbs and you have 2,000 people. There's going to be a higher incidence of anything when you're comparing those numbers, because there's going to be a higher incidence of people with freckles and people with a broken leg. There's going to be higher incidence of everything in the inner city because you have a higher concentration of people. So you got to watch that when you're doing research and studies. The section with the lowest socioeconomic status. They also discovered that the admission rate declined as they moved away from the area into the more affluent suburbs. And again, that could be a truth, and it could also be that there's less people in those areas. Jaco found the number of psychotic admissions in urban areas to be 3 times greater than in rural zones. And again, could be a population thing, could also be the stress of living in the inner city thing. Although rural areas are often poorer than city slums, they are in general less fragmented, with a stronger supportive community based on firmer value systems. And we have a farm down in the country, and that seems to be true. The community is very cemented. There are a lot of very poor people. We had someone kind of come and talk to us on our farm one day, and they were a little bit bitter when we started talking about where we're from and things like that, because they were like, well, we never got the money to move to the big city. And we're thinking, if you live there, why we want to move away from the big city. It's not that great. Clearly it was something you felt like you aspired to but never got to, but you're good where you're at, trust us. But we were surprised that they kind of snapped at us like that, they never got the money to move to the big city. And it's like, okay, we were born there, so we never got the money either. But there's some clear jealousy there. But what are you gonna say? I mean, we didn't get the money to move there and move there. I mean, we're trying to get the money to move away. Another interpretation is offered for this concentration of psychopathology at the low end of the economic ladder: the drift hypothesis. People who exhibit abnormal behavior have drifted downward because they cannot cope effectively with the social demands of a higher class. And I have heard people talking about this when, thinking about marrying someone and marrying into this family or whatever. They feel like they're not good enough. They feel like, oh, well, if I came into this, I wouldn't, know how to behave. And, they expect this and they have this and I don't have this and that. And, so that is a real thing. People feel like they're not good enough sometimes, and they feel like moving up a step would be more stressful. I've heard someone who didn't want to take a management position because they said, I don't want that much responsibility, let somebody else have that. So, that's a real condition that some people have. They cannot hold jobs with much responsibility, which limits their income. With a small income, they cannot afford the trappings of the affluent class, such as the home, the car, the expensive clothes. And that's, a problem for some people. I know some people who, they didn't want to move up. They were scared. They didn't want to do it. And that way they never got the money, to have those things. And then they were bitter about it, but they kind of held themselves back. I know some people who that's kind of their thing. They hold themselves back. They won't do anything to move forward, and then they just complain. And it's like, but wait, you could have done this, you could have done that, but now you just are going to sit there and complain. So, people sometimes have low self-esteem and they defeat themselves by feeling like they can't or don't want to. They defeat themselves. Without all these things, they are unwelcome anywhere but the inner city, which is much more tolerant of differences. And if you've ever done any inner city work, you realize that they are much more tolerant of differences. Because it's people of different religions, people of different belief systems, people different colors, different cultures. So they're a little more tolerant. I grew up a big good chunk of my life in Section 8 housing, and we had foreign people from different places, and people of different colors, and we played together, and so it is more tolerant in the inner city of differences. That's one of the things I was cautionary with my husband about. It's like, this area of town, this area of a place we want to move to, they're all like a certain way, and I'm worried, that they might not be as accepting of me because I'm different from them. And if that's the case, I got 47 acres. You're going to give me some stuff, I'm going to kick you off my 47 acres. If we need a gun, that's what will happen. So, because we got a sheriff and that's it. We ain't got no police department. But so the inner city folks sometimes find solace in the inner city because they fit in, whereas they're afraid they wouldn't fit in, in another place. And I had a friend of mine that I was taken out there and going to meetings with, where I had an office, and they had never experienced the more affluent end of town before, and they said they didn't even know it was out there, and they said this is like a whole different city that they never been to, and I thought that was really interesting, that they were used to this area, and they'd never been to this area, and they didn't realize it was even there, that they made this whole other city out there away from the inner city. So I thought that was an interesting social, commentary there, that, they felt like more affluent people moved and made their own little city, which does happen, I've heard people say that they won't live in a neighborhood that's not a gated community, that doesn't have the HOA and things like that. And personally, I wouldn't live in one of those, because nobody's going to tell me how I'm going to have my house, or what I'm going to do with my house. My house, like I say, is going to be in the middle of 47 acres. You come on my property and tell me what I'm going to do with my house, I'm going to laugh at you and run you off my property with either my dogs or my gun or whatever. So, that's how that'll be. But, Several studies have found support for this theory. Like I said, other theorists feel certain that the stress of living in the inner city contributes to the development of psychopathology, because it is stressful. Let's face it. If you're abject poor, you don't know where your next meal is coming from. You got holes in your shoes. Your clothes are falling apart. You're living in an apartment with roaches. You don't have a car to go anywhere. You're under stress, and that's just a fact. There is no unifying force. The family group is no longer strong, and religion is no longer the stabilizing influence it once was. Because it used to be, more churches were involved in things. They're still trying. I know some good people running some churches, and they're still trying. And, if you're not involved in a church, I kind of feel like, it's a good thing if you can find one that you like. And you can stick with, The social support hypothesis points to the lack of support groups that is characteristic of low-income, low-status areas. Because in low-income, low-status areas, there isn't a lot of social supports. And that's something that one of the agencies that I was working with in my agency were trying to do. We were trying to build a support system, and we had a pretty good one with my agency. I mean, we had a whole binder full of, contacts for anything we could think of. We were doing support groups for victims of abuse and assault. We had a counselor who was doing counseling. We had, a program, a family program to stop abuse. We had classes. We had ministers that were involved in these things that would minister to people. So, for 9 years, I think we did some good in the community. Because the inner city is an ethnically and culturally mixed area, support is more likely to be offered to persons having similar cultural backgrounds. Now, I found that to be the case, like when I was doing some work out there in the poor end of town. One woman told me she did not want my help because I did not look like her and therefore could not understand the life that she had lived. And I tried to tell her I lived in Section 8 and I've lived in some poor places and not known where my next meal was coming from and wearing holey and stained clothing. But she said because I didn't look like her and I hadn't lived her life, I could not possibly understand. And she refused to accept my help. She went to another agency where the people looked more like her. And I think that's a shame, you know. Therefore, it is not surprising that fragmentation is so widespread. And it is. I mean, you know, unfortunately, racism is still being taught. I feel like in my generation, we had a better, you know, deal than the next generation's got. Because we had just about gone away from that in my city. There was like, we didn't care what color you were, what religion. We didn't care about that. We just cared about if you were a good person or not. You know, my parents didn't use these words I'm hearing now. My parents didn't have problems with people. They basically, if you were a nice person, or they considered the word they use trashy person, that's all they cared about. You know, they didn't care about all the rest of the stuff. And so that's how I grew up. You know, as judging people by who they were inside. You know, I didn't look at people and see a color. I didn't look at people and see, you know, what religion they were. I didn't look at people and see, you know, what they believed in. I looked at a person, I saw a person, and I related to them in that way. And if they were a person I didn't like, then I stopped relating to them. If there's someone I did like, then I'd keep relating to them. So, you know, this further generation, and then we did a study on this, me and another group, because we were writing a paper for the government, and we were talking about how the population had grown like 6 times in this city since a certain date. I think it was 93, but I'm not sure. And the people coming from the rural areas and the more suburban areas were coming into the city. And they were taught different things than the people who were already in the city. And so there were some clashes because there was some racism, and then there were also some sexist attitudes coming in that hadn't been in the city for a long time. They had kind of gone out in the 60s, and that wasn't a thing that was happening in the city. But now these things were being brought back in because they were coming from areas where it was more isolated and they were, you know, behind the times. And in one place we're looking at is about 100 years behind the times with their stuff that they had going on. So these were being brought back into the mix, and it was causing, you know, conflict in the city. And that's unfortunate for the generation after me because, like I said, we didn't grow up with that, but they're growing up with it now because there's more people coming in that have these beliefs, and this is happening in our country too. People are coming into charge who have these beliefs and teaching these things to young people. And sorry, young people, these things are wrong. Racism is wrong. Sexism is wrong. God did not prescribe that. You know, you need to go back, like I said, to your red letter edition and read that if you believe that, because we're not in the Old Testament, and we're not trying to take Jerusalem. You know, Jesus said we're supposed to love one another and embrace a stranger in your land, and, you know, those things. Go back and read them red words, because you're being fooled. Mintz and Schwarz found evidence in support of this idea. Among Italian Americans who had an ethnically similar support group, there were fewer hospital admissions for serious mental problems than among those who had limited contact with people from the same culture. So, you know, if you grew up in a culture and then suddenly you don't have that, you know, it's harder on you. You know, a related set of findings was reported by Brenner. He found that the rate of hospital admissions increasing during periods of economic recession. And of course, we know that's true. One obvious interpretation is that jobs are a clear social support that fails in times of economic crisis. And my middle son's going through that now. A company closed and basically threw him out on the street. They made him take their retirement monies, and they didn't take out enough taxes on them and everything. And so now these poor guys, you know, my son had just bought a house 2 months prior to finding out he was going to lose his job. And so he had all these bills stacking up and everything because he thought his life was good and fine. But then these people, closed up and did him dirty. Then he got a job and found out he had a baby on the way. So we're still having some financial troubles, and that's we're trying to win some money, get some money. We're trying to do whatever we can to kind of get him caught up because he's fallen behind and he had some trouble with the IRS because they didn't take enough taxes out. Someone who did his taxes a few years ago did them wrong, and he didn't know it, but they caught it. So he's had even more problems. Had to beg, borrow, and that's a shame. But it is stressful, and it's gonna mess you up a little bit. Without work and the money it supplies, people become more alienated because you're depressed. And I don't know if you've ever been. That's why I say these people who say people abusing the system all the time. It's like, have you ever been in the government center? Have you had to sit there and wait to go through the interview process to get your benefits and stuff? Because if you had to do that, you wouldn't even be there. There might be two people who think it's funny and you can hear them on their phones talking, oh, I'm at the, No, the rest of the 48 people sitting there don't want to be there. They'll do anything. They don't want to be there, So the people abusing the system, there might be 2 out of 50, 49 and 50 might be abusing the system. 48, the other 48 of us, we're there because we have to be there. We don't even want to be there. In addition, the greater numbers of people being affected strain those outside systems of support normally available, such as welfare relief programs, which are overburdened and able to help as much as usual. Because, when you got a few thousand people out of work, okay, they might be able to handle that. When you got 20,000 people out of work or 200,000 people out of work, that becomes a whole different story, doesn't it? To a certain extent, Ling's notion of the sick society fits here. His belief being that the breakdown of the social structure contributes to psychopathology, and it can. However, he ultimately believes that personal choice also has a large role in the development of abnormal behavior. And again, if you find yourself in those situations, you would have to have a very positive outlook on things to not become depressed and upset. So, again, into the nature-nurture thing, there are people who have come from very poor backgrounds who have done well. But they probably had a very good outlook to begin with, and they probably had a very good reinforced, positive social experience, so that they were able to overcome. And he also sees schizophrenia, in particular, as an essential step for personal growth, and that's his opinion. No, no, it's not. But you can explore your personality. You can do different things, and to some people that might look off, and maybe to him that's why he decided that this looked like this, and that's what it was, but not necessarily the case. The psychologists who argue for the sociogenic view see individuals as unwilling but essentially will-less victims. And that's not 100% true either. There's got to be some balance there. But certainly, if you come from abject poverty, your outlook is going to be a little more negative than someone who comes from the affluent suburbs, and that's just a fact. So, sometimes you have to unlearn what you've learned in order to do better. Like I say, when you know better, you can do better. So, that is the case there sometimes. They clearly believe that abnormal behavior is caused by external forces. And now we know external forces can work on you, but they're not the end-all be-all. So as we're starting to see, mental illness, abnormal behavior, can have many reasons. You can start out more, naturally, naturally, my brain just left. Y'all know my tongue. But naturally susceptible to a certain thing. You can have a bad home life, which can lead you further into that. You can have a negative outlook, which can lead you to make poor choices for your life. And then ultimately, you can end up with some serious mental problems. So, all of these things, and that's why we're learning about all of these things can come into the mix and make for abnormal behaviors. So, that's where I'm going to leave you for today. I hope this helped you figure out maybe a little bit more about why you do what you do. If you want to help me out, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Go ahead and like and share this educational program. And that's what it is, an educational program. It's not designed to treat any mental illness. If anything, triggered you, or you think it's a problem in your life that I talked about, then by all means go talk to your mental health professional. Subscribe, and if you want to become a patron, you can do that. The quotes, the links are in my posts. My gosh, it's too hot for my brain today. Thanks for listening or watching. That's all for now. Until next time.